Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Piotrowski. I am an associate professor here at the University of Amsterdam, where I'm in the Youth and Media Studies department in communication science, and I'm also the director of the Center for Research in Children, Adolescents, and the Media. My work really looks at the opportunities of media for children. What can it do to help their lives, educationally, pro-socially, things like that. And so this was sort of a great opportunity for me to speak a little bit about that today. I'd say in the past year and a half, I've really been looking at understanding apps and sort of this amazing opportunity we have to harness the power of apps for kids. And so what I'm going to do today is sort of highlight a little bit about what we know and also a lot about what we don't know, but what I hope to figure out in the coming years. There we go. So I had to kind of figure out what I would talk about today, and I only have 20 minutes, and as a professor I could talk for 20 hours. So I'm only going to just pick a small point today and really focus on apps at home, what it means for this sort of more informal learning opportunities when kids are just playing with apps and sort of what those opportunities might be. And since I'm providing the scientific perspective, what I want to do is give you a couple questions that I hope you can answer by the end of today. And that would be, what do the numbers tell us about access and use? What do we know right now? Are there educational opportunities of apps? Is there any research that would support that argument? When we talk about that, what factors are important to consider? And this is factors from a research perspective, but also from a development perspective. And lastly, where do I think we're going? Because this is really, from the research side, still a new field, and we're trying to figure this out. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm thinking about today, and so I want to give you a definition to keep in mind. When I'm thinking about an educational app, and that's sort of a heavy loaded term, I think, in many ways, what I'm really talking about is two things. One, I'm looking for apps where the developers really understood the child. They were understanding sort of the child's needs and how a child learns and can interact with this technology. And second, really had a goal of supporting some educational or social outcome. That was a goal from the outset. And I point this out because there's a lot of things kids learn all day long. This is what their job is, right? Learning is what they do. So I'm looking here really at apps that were really thinking initially about some outcome, some goal. Okay. So first thing, these numbers. What do we know? What's going on right now? A lot of you in the room are creating this content. A lot of you know this information, but just to make sure we're on the same page. When we're talking about app access, this was some data that came out actually from Remco's team, I guess almost a year and a half, 18 months ago now, really looking at access. And one thing we saw is that in homes of about, from birth to 7 here in the Netherlands, for example, 67% of kids were growing up in a home with an app or with a tablet in their home. And this number is only increasing. So we know that they're having more opportunities to interact with this content. We also know from some American data, and I'm hoping to get some Dutch data very soon from my own center, that when you look here at the colors, everything that's not yellow is sort of any time spent using educational media. So we know that kids, this is between 2 and 10 years old, we know that more than 50% of kids between 2 and 10 reportedly spend some time every day using some form of educational media. And we also know that about 35% of these kids are accessing it on some sort of mobile device. Now, 35% doesn't sound that, it sounds okay, but from a seminar where we're talking about apps, it doesn't sound amazing. Well, actually, this is 2 to 10-year-olds. And when you break this down, what you see actually is that it's particularly high for our youngest kids. So our 2 to 4-year-olds are really, really playing with educational apps quite consistently, 78% of them. And you see a really dramatic decrease between those 2-year-olds and by the time we get to 10. We see this really dramatic change. And when people talk about it and sort of speculate why this is, some people say, well, as kids get older, they have more things to do. They're going to school, they're in more formal sports, there's other things taking up their time. Other people say, well, maybe it reflects that there's not so much for them as they get a little bit older. And I think there's something to this. Now, you could say, well, it's because kids are not interested in educational apps. And I do think that that's important to keep in mind. But take a look at what they call the app gap. This is data from 2011, so this actually looks, the patterns look quite similar. But what we see is when you look at the top 200 apps, for example, in the educational app store, for example, the iTunes store, what you see is in 2011, 58% were trying to reach the youngest group. And you see a decent number saying, oh, adults are our interest. But look at that dip in between. That's a really very stunning image to see. There's just not a lot of effort going into thinking about what about the kids in the middle? What about when they get a little bit older? Now, it's not easy to make something that supports pro-social or educational content enticing. Of course, that's where the creative ideas come in, and how do you do that well? But I do think this is a really interesting call to developers to say, hey, the market for our preschoolers is really becoming saturated. It's becoming harder and harder to cut through that clutter. But there's a whole bunch of people in the middle. There's a lot of kids that we could go after that we haven't yet figured out yet. And I think that's important. Well, what does it mean to sort of figure this out? What does it mean to say, how do we do this? Well, when we talk about creating an educational app, I want to be really clear that first and foremost, for those of you who create these apps, you know it has to be fun. It has to be enjoyable. The main idea, kids need to want to play this game. And if we create things that aren't enjoyable, they'll check it out because someone told them to, and then they sort of drift off. Well, this idea is really known as entertainment education. And when we're talking about that, the notion, the argument it's pretty straightforward. If you can create content that's really engaging, get me involved, keep me involved, I have sustained play and greater attention for it. Leads to greater learning. That's really the whole argument of entertainment education in a nutshell. You want to stay with it. We look at things like television, Sesame Street, Dora the Explorer, these contents where first and foremost they've created content that you want to be a part of. You want to follow the narrative. You want to see what's going on. That's interesting to you. And just so happens that educational content has really been merged successfully in this area. And this is what I really think a really good app can do well. A really good app can say, and this is the part that I can't help at, the creative side. I can give creators tips on this is what is best practices in learning. This is what's best practices in formatting the content. But the creative side comes from the brilliance in the designers and thinking through how do we make this content so enjoyable that kids stay in this state of flow. They stay in this period where they want to keep going. So it doesn't bore them and it's not too complicated for them. And we know, one of the questions I posed at the beginning is I said, well, is there evidence that this could work? Shockingly, there's not a lot yet. And this is what my job is as a researcher. My job is to start answering this question. But there's some early evidence to suggest that an app that really is well made, that understands who the child is, understands what's going to be entertaining to them, and knows the sort of content that that's age appropriate for them, that they can learn it. So for example, there's an app by Superwise. Superwise is an American television show that's been designed to support children's literacy skills. And the team of developers spent a lot of time creating this content, clear knowledge of who the child is, and really a good sense of what's going to be enjoyable to them. And in a simple pre-post test study, so this is not the most scientifically rigorous study, but they did look at trends. And what they saw, for example, is some of the youngest kids experienced a change in vocabulary of upwards of 17% after playing this game. That tells me there's something happening there. Similarly, another game, a game called Martha Speaks, this is a game that's really designed, it's an app where children, they interact with vocabulary, but in a really fun way where they get to pop bubbles and make noises and all kinds of funny sounds, and they're learning vocabulary along the way. There was gains of upwards of 27% in a pre-post design. I have criticisms of the methodology behind this, and that's my job to do these things better. But I think this sort of research points to the idea that a really well-designed app can make a difference in our kids' lives. But what it also points to, you see these differences here. For example, we see these different patterns by age. And I said there's factors we need to keep in mind. As developers, as researchers, as parents, as practitioners, things we need to keep in mind. And one of the big ones is that not all kids are affected by media content in the same way. There are not universal effects of media content. It doesn't work that way. There are differences by age. There are differences by gender. There are differences by whether or not children are really experienced with the technology. There's an interesting area I'm studying now where we find certain kids are really interested in learning. Certain kids, they just gotta know the answer to the question and they just keep pursuing it and pursuing it. These guys experience apps differently. That makes sense. So one thing is to start trying to understand more which kids can really benefit, how do we parse that out? And that's some of the questions I'm answering in my center. But we also have to keep in mind there's issues of when we're developing content and evaluating it, what's the context of this use? How is it being used? With whom is it being used? And we really have to look specifically, and remember, not all content's the same. That shouldn't be surprising to most of you in the audience who play a role in creating this content, but there are differences, and we need to start understanding, what does that mean? What differences, how does that predict outcomes? Let me give you some examples. So when we're talking about content, we have this idea that there's certain factors, and this is what a big role in my center has been right now, is to start trying to distill, what are some factors? If an app creator comes to me and says, listen, I've never gotten into this before, but I want to get into the market of creating apps for kids. Can you give me some tips? We're trying to figure out what are some empirically based tips we can give. Some things we know, for example, is that moderately discrepant content seems to work really well. And by this I mean figuring out what does your target audience generally know and just pushing the envelope a little bit, making it a little bit different, a little novel. That tends to really keep your kid engaged and enjoying it. So this means we're still using this notion that we know familiarity is important, but just a little different, and being able to say, okay, as the kid gets familiar with your content, it changes a little bit more to constantly stay in this zone of moderate discrepancy. We also know that scaffolding really matters, and if you've created content or played good games, you'll often see that this scaffolding is present. And by that I mean thinking about levels. We want to keep, when you think about engaging a child, what we know is it can't be too difficult because then they get overwhelmed and pull back, and it can't be too easy because then they get bored. So in between, there's this little zone known as flow, and that's where we want our kid to be. So we need to level the content so it keeps challenging them so much, but not so much that it overwhelms them. And you might do that through hints and clues to kind of help your kids get to the next point, or even leveraging their wrong answers to help them learning along the way. What we know so far from the research is that when these things happen, kids generally benefit more from the apps and stay with them longer, play them longer, and actually find them more enjoyable. We like a little bit of a challenge. We like a little bit. That's this pleasantly frustrating experience that people talk about really is important. We also know, and those of you who develop apps certainly are thinking about this all the time, this is a really interesting area now, thinking through usability. Computer technology and digital media has made us think about usability in ways that traditionally television-based content never did. Thinking through, what gestures are you relying on? We know, for example, that the tap for younger kids is the most intuitive feature. We know that it can be hard for a 4-year-old to keep their finger on that screen the whole time. If you ever watch them play, it's hard to stay on that whole time. And we know, and those who make apps certainly notice, that pinch that we do so much on our iPad, that's really hard to do. That requires fine motor skills. And the number of apps that people have sent me and said, here, and I'll look at this app and I think, oh, it's so beautiful, it has such great potential. But a 4-year-old cannot pinch and move and can't hold. These sort of gestures, knowing the audience and recognizing these things is really important. And if you're creating content for preschoolers, so our 3, 4, 5s, I really like this document that Sesame Street put together on designing touch tablet experiences for preschoolers, because it makes you stop and think about, oh yeah, I forgot. I don't remember when I was 4, but that makes sense that that would be tough for them. So these sorts of questions, what I've found so far and what the research is pointing to is when we really think about user-centered design, think about the child and know what's usable for them. If it's usable, they enjoy it more. They play with it longer, we have a greater chance of learning. Pretty reasonable. So there are key tips from the content side. But of course I mentioned there's also this context point, keeping the idea of context in mind. Let me give you an example of that. A lot of studies have pointed to this term that they use in the scientific literature, joint media engagement. Basically it means kids are using this content in different ways with other people. Well, one really big area of joint media engagement is with the parent. And a lot of this makes a lot of sense. The parent can be the gatekeeper, right? Whether or not that app's going to get in front of their child, parent plays a role there. The parent can be a facilitator. A lot of times that initial experience with the app requires a little bit of help figuring out how to do this. Parent can be the teacher. Oh, they were practicing this skill, or they learned this lesson, they learned sharing or caring in one thing, and they bring it up later in another setting. Remember? Do you remember when you untied the worm in Toka Pet Doctor and how you made that worm feel so much better? You just made your sister feel better right now, connecting that content. And even the co-player, where they play with their child. All of this is a form of joint media engagement. Well, this context, how these parents, for example, interact and use this app content really influences what kids get out of it. Let me show you, let me give you an example of this. It's an interesting project done by a colleague of mine. And they had parents come in, parents sat down with their kids, and a group of parents sat down with their child and gave them a storybook. And they said, just read the book. Read the book to your child like you normally would. Another group came in, and they said, here, just read the book like you normally would. This time it was on an iPad. The exact same book. It didn't have hot spots, it didn't have animations, it was just the exact same book. And then they paid attention to what happened in the situation, what parents were saying to their kids. Parents who were reading the traditional storybook, they heard things like, oh, isn't this bunny so cute? Or, do you know how to turn the page? Really, these very integrative, important, high-quality conversation. Then we heard parents in the app group, don't touch the scissors. There was an image of scissors on the book, and they didn't want them to touch. Don't touch the page. Don't touch the iPad. Don't climb on me. This is a very qualitatively different experience that these kids were having. Same book, qualitatively different experience. Researchers went on and they said, well, let's see how much the kids remembered from this story. So we have our traditional book. We remembered a good deal of content. Then we have our iPad book, significantly less amount of content. And when they started analyzing it, what they found is the more that parent engaged in those distracting, don't touch the book, don't touch anything, don't break the book, the less the child remembered. Now some people said, oh, iPads, they're really bad for reading. This is proof kids don't learn so much from it. But the authors, and actually I as well, think that's not really what that says. That says that we need to help parents feel more comfortable with using this technology and recognize this is a contextual fear that parents have. I invested a lot of money in this iPad. I don't want it to break. The book was €10, the iPad was €300. And I think that this is something we need to be sensitive to. And I just saw recently Amazon created a new children's tablet. And I loved the commercial that they sent me. It was so entertaining because they said, listen, you can take that tablet and put it in the blender, dump all the pieces in a box and send it back to us. We'll give you a new one. 2-year warranty, no questions asked. Think about that. That's a really interesting idea of somebody recognizing, hey, there is a fear of something might happen. And if that fear is changing and really causing a qualitatively different experience for our kids when they're using these apps, what can we do about that? And I think that this idea of recognizing sometimes when we're saying, oh, it doesn't seem like the apps are so great, maybe we need to look at the experience and recognize that that context is playing a role. So those of you who know this already, these are the 3 C's we need to keep in mind when we're asking these questions. Yes, it seems that high-quality apps can support children's educational and social skills. But this is dependent on issues of who the child is, the context of their use, and the content and how it's defined. The 3 C's. And these are the things I think as researchers we need to keep in mind and as developers that are really crucial. And moving forward in our center, what we plan to do is really keep these 3 C's in mind where we begin asking questions such as iPad schools. What's going on with that? Opportunities, concerns? What about 21st century thinking? Over and over again, I hear people saying to me, 21st century thinking skills, flexible thinking, this is the wave of digital media. We want to start asking these questions and really moving forward. Design, figuring out the way. How do you find the happy marriage between learning and fun? That's a lot of the questions that my students and I are asking right now. What about that contextual role of the parents? How can we give them messages? How can I talk to parents and say, listen, I don't want you to worry so much about the iPad breaking because that does actually negate some of the benefits of your story time. And helping teachers figure out, more and more teachers are asking, how do I bring this in? Everyone says to me, put iPads in the classroom. I don't know what to do with them. That's our job as researchers. That's what I view one of my jobs is to help them figure out how do we do this well. We're beginning that right now, doing several things. Some of you who've actually been in the app lab might have seen there's been people sitting in the corner asking kids lots of questions. They're my students. I have a project running here right now at Cinekid where I'm trying to understand that blend of design and learning, and I'm looking at it with kids who people often neglect, our 8 to 10-year-olds, and really trying to understand what makes a good creative app. Do these apps really enhance creativity? Do they lead to engagement? And which creative apps are sort of really appealing for kids and why? So that data will be finished being collected in about 2 hours or so. My students are hardworking right now. And then I'll be analyzing that and putting that out to sort of really have a good reach on things to do when thinking through creativity and apps for kids. And also, I'm very excited because we were able to get funding, and I have a doctoral student who's working with me now that just launched in September. I have a 3-year project ongoing called There's an App for That, and I'll be releasing pieces of it over the next 3 years, where we're really trying to understand a couple key things. When a parent is faced with the decision of what app do I choose, what's important to them? So we're working with this right now, and we have interviews starting in November talking to parents about what's important to you. Then we're going to be talking to researchers and developers, so anybody who's in the room, I might be talking to you as well to understand what's important to you when you create content or study content. And then we're actually looking at what's going on in the entire app landscape right now. We're doing a really sophisticated analysis of trying to figure out, parents say they want this, developers say they're doing this, what's actually happening and what's really going on, and understanding these key features and best practices in app design. And lastly, we're going to test it out with kids. And what we'll do is over the next 3 years, as these projects roll out, we'll be releasing reports, both academic and industry formatted reports, and we'll be popping them up on our website. Here's my official center plug, where we will make sure that everything is available full text for everyone to access. All of our research are posted on our website, and we'll also make sure to actively tweet it. So anybody who has their phones and wants to start following us, you're welcome to do so. And what we do in our center is not only will we be sharing this app research, but obviously also the other research. We have we have 20 active researchers in our center right now, really trying to understand what media's work, how media can positively benefit our kids today, and also the places where we need to stop and be aware of potential risks. So that's sort of my 20-minute spiel on what's going on in the research. There's obviously a lot more to know, but I hope this gave you a flavor for the types of questions we're asking. And I welcome any questions. You're welcome to follow up with me in email, however you might like.
I have one question to start
Yes.
with about the parent fear.
Yeah.
Parents fearing the iPad will break. Are there other reasons as well? For example, bad content with too much?
I certainly think that when the experience, if it's problematic content, you're going to see these different things. But what we often see is when the content is quite similar in different settings, there's a reservation that they might break the iPad. And often it's not the child's iPad, it's the parent's iPad. We'll hear, for example, or it's their phone. And they're like, oh, I don't want them to break it, I don't want them to break it. So they get anxious, and then the child doesn't get to fully engage with the content in the way it was designed.
And does it happen a lot that parents interact with their children? Using the tablet?
It's often not that the parent's interacting. It's more that they'll give it to their child, but then they'll constantly, oh, wait, don't do that. Well, be careful with it. Don't do that. And so there's often this sort of looking over their shoulder. So they're maybe not sitting with them and using it the whole time, but it's more oh, I don't like when she's using this. I don't like that app at all because it encourages her to do too much.
Do you think they should, parents?
Interact with their children more?
Yeah, sitting.
I think that's hard to tell parents to do that all the time, because I do think parents have other things they're trying to do. But I always try to encourage parents the first time out, check it out with your child to make sure it meets your values and that you're aware of it and that you feel comfortable with it. And then I think it's okay to encourage independent play.
Okay. How is it with teachers? Do you have scientific research on that?
Well, there's some things going on with teachers, but with teachers it's really complicated right now, because I feel like what often happens is that teachers are sort of encouraged to use this technology with very little training on how to use this technology. And it's very complicated because, particularly if you were trained in a particular method where you lecture to the students and then they sort of do worksheets and math problems in these things, and then someone says, here's a new technology, it should be great. How do I do it? How do I integrate this in? So I think you see incredible opportunities when teachers are given tips on here's a way to use this. But I think without training, it's really complicated for them. And I think that makes sense for any of us. We get a new software program at work, and you hear for days, I don't know how to use the new version of Office, and let alone, and we're all struggling until we figure it out. And that's what happens to teachers. Here you go. Good luck.
Is that the case in the iPad classes too?
Yeah, well, some of them. We've seen, for examples, in LA, for example, you really saw this interesting story happening where there wasn't really enough information on how to use this. And I think part of it is because we don't know yet. We see a lot of great technology. We see opportunities for learning, but we're still working on how you do this together and how you do it well. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
From the UK.